Wow, where to start? I have made at least one visit to Yellowstone National Park every year for the past 11 years, and many times before that in my youth. It's been the backdrop for countless adventures and family memories, but it's also a wild and primal landscape not to be underestimated. Perhaps never before has Yellowstone's wild character and potential hazards been more obvious than they've been these last few days, when I and my family were present for what has been called a 1,000-year event. We arrived at the entrance to Yellowstone on June 10th, 3 days before the park would be closed. Now, in Yellowstone, dramatic weather is nothing new. In fact, if you plan a visit to Yellowstone, I advise you prepare for multiple seasons in a single day. I've had snowball fights with my kids in summer with freshly fallen snow, cycled more than a few miles in heavy rain and blazing sun, sometimes in the same day. I've witnessed years of heavy spring melt and high temperatures, but I've never seen anything like the flooding that occurred this past weekend and has now resulted in the complete closure of Yellowstone National Park. Currently, water levels are still extremely high, and most of the park is too hazardous for even park rangers to explore. So a full assessment is likely still a few days to weeks away. But while we wait for further details, I thought I'd share what it was like to actually be in Yellowstone during this unprecedented flood. The trip began normal enough. I set up camp, logged some bike miles, and enjoyed the park's wildlife, including a distant wolf sighting and catching up with a familiar face, Grizzly 881, the imposing 19-year-old boar who made worldwide news when he and Grizzly 791 went head-to-head along the banks of the Yellowstone River, battling over a mature elk cached by 791 a few days prior. If you haven't seen my video of the event, then make sure to go check it out. It's the type of Yellowstone bear sighting that most visitors dream of, but almost no one gets to witness in person. Shortly after this distant sighting of Grizzly 881, the rain began to fall, and rarely let up for close to 3 days, alternating between light mist and full-on downpour. At first, the meadows and wetlands began to flood, creating new reflecting ponds. But as the 2 to 3 inches of new rainfall mixed with approximately 7 inches of rapid snowmelt, thanks to last week's record high temperatures, every river and stream in the park became a raging brown torrent. Valleys were transformed into muddy marshlands, campgrounds and picnic areas were flooded, and the river began expanding into woodlands and toward park roadways. My experience during the flood is limited to the northeast section of the park, where along with the northwest section of the park, flooding was the most severe. Now, I've seen heavy runoff before, but the unrelenting rain, mixed with heavier than average snowmelt, transformed Yellowstone quite suddenly. At first, I thought it was just another rainy weekend in Yellowstone. What I didn't realize at the time is that I was witnessing history. The flooding of June 2020 is the only natural event that has ever completely closed Yellowstone National Park. On Saturday, typically calm, tranquil rivers and creeks throughout the park became quite hazardous. According to Cam Shawley, Yellowstone superintendent, many remain hazardous, keeping park staff from fully assessing the damage. On Sunday, the rivers were bursting, picnic areas were flooding, and roadways began failing. I didn't know it at the time, but hours after driving along the park's northeastern road, sections I had just traveled while marveling at the rising water levels began crumbling. Campgrounds and picnic areas I had frequented for years vanished, submerged beneath floodwaters. I was witnessing Yellowstone, a park that had changed relatively little since my childhood, being transformed. Before the storm relented, Park Service homes and bridges would be washed away. This structure, once housing 6 Park Service employees and their families, was ripped from the riverbank and dragged down the Yellowstone River for miles. Thankfully, all residents had been evacuated and have since been given temporary accommodations, and no one is known to have been injured during the flood.
Holy crap!
Drinking water throughout the park and surrounding communities has been contaminated, and some towns are now isolated as they deal with similar devastation in their own neighborhoods. These are among the very last images I captured before breaking camp in the downpour. I have visited the area seen here many, many times before, often during heavy spring runoff. But on this occasion, the normally clear snowmelt waters turned into a thick, thundering, muddy cascade, on a scale never witnessed in living memory. And even though I didn't know how historic the flooding was at the time, it became clear to me after 2.5 days of bursting skies and hazardously swollen rivers that it was time to call it and go home. Shortly after my family and I broke camp, the Park Service closed all northern entrances to the park and began evacuating visitors from the northern half of the park to the south. 2 hours after closing the northern entrances, the Park Service closed all entrances to the park and began evacuating all visitors. As I edit this video, 12 backcountry visitors are the only civilians still in the park, and they too are being evacuated. To me, Yellowstone has always been the embodiment of the words wild and unpredictable. Years of exploring the park have shown me you never can tell exactly what Yellowstone will throw at you, and it's essential to be prepared and able to adapt and even change plans depending on whatever this incredible landscape throws your way. Never was that more true than this past weekend. This week's unprecedented flooding was yet another reminder that Mother Nature sets the rules, and we simply have to learn to abide by them. Yet, I can't help but wonder, how responsible are we for what happened in Yellowstone last weekend? It wasn't the rain alone that caused this unprecedented flood. It was the mix of record rainfall and record temperatures. I know that there are many who doubt that humans have the ability to change the climate of an entire planet. But consider this. Raindrops are vastly more infinitesimal than we humans. A single raindrop would never stand a chance of tearing a house from its foundation. Even millions of raindrops would lack the power to cast a home into a torrential river. Yet, whatever the sum total number of raindrops that fell on the slopes of Yellowstone National Park this week, it was more than enough to tear this home's foundation out from underneath it and drag it down the river to destruction. This planet is our home. She's glorious, and she's the only one we've got. Are we strengthening her foundations or weakening them? Like individual raindrops, there's only so much that each of us can do. But collectively, we possess awesome power to destroy or to heal. And I wonder if that isn't the lesson that should linger with us long after the floodwaters recede. Whatever your views, I desperately hope we'll use this opportunity to reflect on what is needed to restore and preserve responsible access to our parks and wildlands. Not just the roads and structures destroyed during the recent flooding in and around Yellowstone, but to help all of our overworked and underfunded parks and natural systems thrive. We are visiting national parks and public lands in record numbers. We ought to make caring for them a greater priority than ever before. Taking care of our parks and restoring and improving their infrastructure isn't just about what's best for the parks. There are numerous communities who very much depend on access to Yellowstone and our public lands. Many of those communities surrounding Yellowstone are in for some hard times as they address the flood damage in their own neighborhoods, but also as their primary source of income is threatened with reduced access to Yellowstone National Park. Taking care of our parks is about what's best for our parks and what is best for people. That's really what caring for wild spaces is all about. It's about caring for and connecting to our natural resources and the people who depend on those resources. In other words, all of us. Sections of Yellowstone will almost certainly reopen within a few weeks' time, but other sections, mostly along the northern road, will likely remain closed for the duration of the season. So make sure to stay tuned for updates on the full scope of the damage caused by this week's flood and possible limitations on access to Yellowstone in the coming months. If you had a trip to Yellowstone planned and you're concerned that you might not get to explore the park, remember, Greater Yellowstone is much more than Yellowstone National Park. There are spectacular and breathtaking areas throughout Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. Some of the best advice I can give you right now is to branch out and discover what you never knew existed. If you plan to visit any of our parks this year or any year, remember they are wild and unpredictable landscapes and that your safety very much depends on your attitude toward them. Mother Nature is simultaneously very generous and at times very harsh. Show her and our parks the respect they deserve. If you're unsure on how to have a safe visit on your next national park trip, or you want to make sure you get only the very best information, Then make sure to subscribe to At Home in Wild Spaces for more genuinely reliable news and outdoor information. And until next time, this is Mike, wishing you a year of safe, responsible, and wild adventures.